Belling History with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of these here United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the Pacific Northwest. We are your hosts. I'm Ren. I almost said Colby.
And I'm Colby.
And you're Colby.
And we are co-owners of Belling History Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about all of that, visit our website at bellinghistory.com. Today we have another re-release episode from Bad Town, Season 2 of the City of Subdued podcast, hosted by Annika Fleming, Maria Dalla Gasparina, co-hosted by us, as well as our founding mother, Marissa McGrath. And again, I recorded all these back in 2020 during the pandemic. They're some of our favorite bad Belling history stories. If you hadn't listened to the previous one, you might want to listen to that before this one because they're kind of tied together. So that was The Bad Butcher. And now we're going to talk about the continuation. It's kind of a whole nother story of its own, but
really
they are linked.
You'll know why not later on, but today's episode is called Bad Murder Farm Town, something like that. But yeah, you're going to want to stick around and listen because we have a little bit of updates and some more fun Colby insider information that I'm stoked for you guys to listen to. If you hadn't listened to the last one or you're new to the Good Time Girls, these are stories we've told for about a darn decade on our tours.
Yeah.
And so many folks in Bellingham know the story of the butchered butcher and the murder farm. But yeah, we're going to elaborate a little bit and you're going to get
Some new thoughts. Yes.
We hope you're going to stick around.
Last week, you left us hanging in the case of the butchered butcher. I think you were just about to tell us about a suspect in that case that popped up years later after a string of murders happened in Maple Falls.
Yeah, exactly. So if you guys recall, the case of the butcher, Frederick Dames, went dormant after a number of leads went nowhere. But 5 years later, a man named Frank Romendorf from Maple Falls was in the news for a series of brutal and unrelated murders beginning in November of 1909, and whose trial had been in the news pretty heavily in January of 1910.
Was this the killer we've been looking for the whole time? What did he do?
Well, we're not sure. We're going to get into that. He did lots of stuff, though. Frank Romendorf, terrible things. So Frank Romendorf, as he went by, at the time of that all this went down, he was from Maple Falls. Shocker, I know. If you are familiar with Maple Falls, it's like, do you know where Maple Falls is? It's like you're going up to Mount Baker, you're almost to Glacier. It's like Kendall, Peaceful Valley area in there.
Oh, yes. I did several student teachings up in that area.
It's an interesting place, a little dark, a little shady. I'll just leave it at that.
There was descriptions of like bear fights there where they'd keep a freaking bear in a cage and then drunk men would go out and wrestle with these black bears.
I think it's like a dark place with a dark past. That's how I picture Maple Falls. Not a lot of sunlight hitting those folks.
Right? People
they need some vitamin D.
Out in Maple Falls.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
So that's where Romendorf lives with his wife, Margaret, and his supposedly son, Ed, and 2 daughters on what the newspapers later referred to as a murder farm. The Maple Falls Murder Farm, as we like to say. So it all started on a dark and spooky evening in Maple Falls. This big rainstorm blows through, and the next morning, Romendorf's neighbor, James Logan, is for some reason missing. A lot of people assumed he had been swept away in the river during the storm, but his boots and glasses were still in his house, so probably, unless he wandered out barefoot without his glasses, probably not the case. And right after this, Romendorf, the neighbor, left town on business and didn't come back. So, in fact, Romandorf had assumed Logan's identity and started a new life for himself in eastern Washington. He bought property and he even hired a housekeeper who just happened to have a rather large inheritance coming to her, which was convenient for him. So he was like, hey, housekeeper Agnes Jansen, do you want to marry me? And she's like, oh, I do. And so they plan a wedding trip. And while they're on their way on their wedding trip, they're trudging along in their wagon. He's like, oh, I'm lost. It's getting dark. We better pull over here. So fast forward a little bit, he's built a very large fire on the side of the road where he pulled over. 2 local men come up to see why there's this ginormous bonfire happening. And he's like, oh, I'm just lost, camping here for the night. And guess what? He was alone. The men thought it was a little weird that he had such a giant fire, but they left. And of course, then
What? Weird.
right?
Really?
So they did come back the next day. They're like, that was weird. Let's go see what was going on with that guy's fire. They go back over there and they poke through the ashes and find metal corset stays and an engagement ring. This is reportedly attached to a skeleton hand that crumbles when they touch it. There's definitely some kind of crime suspected here, and the police are now on the lookout for this guy under the description of Romandorf. And he was actually caught and apprehended while he was trying to cash in, guess what, Agnes's inheritance by forging documents as her husband. So he gives the name Logan at the time. He's still going under this, remember the disappeared neighbor, Logan's name? So he's going under Logan's name, and pictures circulate around with law enforcement, and they looking for information on this guy they've captured who they think is James Logan. And it pretty quickly comes to light that it's not James Logan. It's this guy, Frank Romandorf from Maple Falls, who happens to be James Logan's neighbor. So pretty quickly, the whole murder of Agnes Jansen gets unraveled, and Romandorf/Logan is sent to Walla Walla State Pen to await execution for her murder. He denied it and then admitted it, and back and forth several times, and occasionally tried to pretend like he was nuts. And during his time in the pen, we find out all kinds of weird things about him, including that his name is not even actually Romandorf. His birth name was Friedrich Johns, and he's a German. So there's an article from right before the Herald decided he was connected to the Dame story that describes him. And this is from the Colville Examiner in eastern Washington, and it says, his silvery locks lend more of an air of benevolence to his German features, and a pair of knowing eyes gleam brightly from beneath heavy eyebrows as he becomes interested in a conversation. It also describes a visit by a preacher to Logan in which Logan was like, I don't want your sympathy or your spiritual assistance. And he was quoted as saying, I would 1,000 times rather risk my life and property with the worst convicts of any nation than among some others out of jail, particularly lawyers and some preachers. So he condemns churches and he goes on and on. The article also states he's traveled all over the world. He worked in gold mines of East Africa. He claimed he served in the Boer War, which is an African thing that the timelines just don't add up with his story. So he claimed a lot of things, that he had been in an Asian caravan and revolutions in South and Central America, on and on. Clearly he's just, excuse my French, but he's effing with everybody here. He's just making stuff up at this point. And also the writer of the article kind of marvels that his certainty that at the beginning of his trial that he would not be convicted and he would regain his freedom. They speculated, that he had tons of money that only he knew about, that he had hidden away somewhere. He was an interesting guy, full of mysteries.
So he sounds like a really, really great guy, thinks he's smarter than everyone, silvery locks, bushy eyebrows.
Yeah, wait till you see his picture.
How did he get connected to the Dames case from 5 years ago? Or not 5 years ago, but 5 years before this whole thing.
Right. So Dames is murdered 5 years before any of this comes to light. And like we said, I mean, these are unrelated murders, although brutal and disgusting murders nonetheless. But in 1910, on February 13th, the Herald announces Dames murder mystery solved. Romendorf killed Elk Street butcher. And there were reports that they were friends and they had both come from the same locality in Germany and had known each other for several years in Bellingham, and that they had quarreled over a meat delivery to Romendorf by Dames. The altercation in the butcher shop in which Romendorf was ejected, he was also seen in the city the night of the murder. All this information doesn't come to light until 5 years later when all of this, starts making the news about the Agnes Jansen Logan murders. So there's no suspects at the time, but all of a sudden people are like, yeah, actually, you know what? I think I saw Romendorf in that guy's butcher shop and they were arguing, and so all of these exciting stories come out about how Romendorf was probably in that butcher shop. The story goes from one of the witnesses is that Romendorf was seen in Dames's butcher shop the day before the murder, and he and Dames were arguing loudly in German. But nobody knew what they were arguing about. They couldn't understand it. And so as Romendorf goes to leave the butcher shop, Dames throws a butcher knife across the room, narrowly missing Romendorf's head. So, I mean, you would think that kind of suspicion would have come to light in the first place.
Yeah, you think somebody would have remembered saying something like that.
But we're going to go with it. But although, when Romendorf is being questioned, when he's admitting and then recanting admissions to all of these murders, he never ever mentions Dames or the butcher. The Herald, concluded that this case was solved. And that's probably because, I'm sure you can imagine the citizens of Bellingham were just a little bit uneasy thinking that this axe murderer might still be on the loose that had butchered this guy 5 years ago. So when Romendorf is brought in for all these brutal murders, it's like, okay, we're eager here to pin this on this guy too. So we can't be sure. It does, sound like something that Romendorf would do, and we'll give you some more evidence in that direction. But again, a little fishy.
Okay, so we know he has Logan and Agnes. He's killed them for sure. He's possibly killed this butcher, but maybe not. It's up in the air. However, you did use the term murder farm, which makes me wonder if there's a lot more people.
There are.
Yeah, exactly. It's, not those two stories alone. And the pieces of this puzzle kind of begin to come together in the 1940s, actually, when this curious criminologist from the Washington State Attorney General picked up the case and began doing some investigations of his own. And in his search, he found retired Bellingham detective Thomas DeHaven, who agreed to be interviewed about him. So from those interviews, we get a few more interesting details, which surprisingly didn't come out or make the news. I'm not sure, Colby, maybe you can confirm or deny that. But apparently, what we know is that Romendorf moved to Maple Falls somewhere around 1903 after a scrape with the law in Nebraska, where he was doing some cattle rustling.
Confirmed. That's where his wife's family is from.
Right. And yes, okay. Confirmed. According to DeHaven's, Romendorf's nephew, Ed Romendorf. Yeah, so they are saying nephew in this. Ed is also referred to as Frank's son in different circumstances. So Ed arrives shortly after Frank, whoever he is. And it's at this point that the Romendorfs kind of begin to hire help. And the story goes that they're kind of hiring help from these working agencies in Seattle. And they're always avoiding hiring local people. According to this detective, Romendorf had always insisted that his workers never leave the property. But at least on 2 occasions, workers did leave, and they found their way into Maple Falls to air their grievances about Romendorf and the terrible working conditions, and in those 2 instances, broken financial promises, where Romendorf is promising that he's going to give them money, or he has a deed to their property, or he's going to help them clear land, but he's like going back on it and just kind of forcing them into this like labor situation. And by the way, they complain about like the terrible food and, disgusting places to sleep and things like that. So those 2 men, they make it into Maple Falls, they air their grievances, and then they tell witnesses that they're going to go back to the farm and collect their pay or what have you. And then they're never heard from again. One of those men, when he made his way back into Maple Falls, he did report to police, apparently, that Ed Romendorf, son or nephew, had tried to kill him by trying to push him into a shingle saw.
Wow. Okay. So it seems like Murder Farm is not too far off after all. So thank goodness this guy was all the way in Walla Walla, but that can't be the end of the story. What happens to this guy?
Right. Well, he's sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, as it was said at the time. Meanwhile, he's in Walla Walla awaiting hanging, right? He tells a lot of people he knows that he's been busy for months writing the story of his life. And he's like, I have this huge manuscript, and it's all written in code that no one can decipher. And he will leave a key among his belongings in case he should hang. While he was there, he tried to get his sentence commuted. He wrote letters to the governor trying to say, this is all a conspiracy concocted against me. It's all fabricated. But then in March of 1911, another corpse was found connected to him. It was a man named Shively who was found buried in a trunk stuffed into sawdust and an old abandoned mill in Colville County.
That one scares me so much. That one's creepy too. I wonder if we should talk about that. I don't know if that interrupts your flow too much, Colby, but
if you want to talk about it, go for it.
This one, yeah, like I said, creeps me out the most. And he was actually, they were doing some business deal, I guess, and Romendorf, I guess Logan at this point, says, okay, yeah, I'll buy, your property from you or whatever. And he's like, well, we'll meet at this hotel or inn or something, and we'll, exchange the deed, and I'll give you the money. And what ends up happening is Romendorf Logan gets the money and then, bashes him over the head and drugs him and puts him in a trunk and sends his body back to Colville to be buried in this trunk. And the story goes that he's put on the train. And then Romendorf Logan tells his ranch hands, don't open it, don't ask questions, just bury it for me. And apparently that's what they dig up.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting about Romendorf Logan, whatever the hell his name is that when he was in Nebraska, he worked as an engraver, and he learned like a lot of artistry around, making engravings and beautiful writing and signatures. So he basically became an expert at forgery. And so a lot of his crimes involved killing people and then forging their names for deeds for property or money and things like that. Which was definitely the case with Shively also. So yeah, the governor's like, yeah, nope, you're going to hang. Sorry. No pardon for you. And he was executed by hanging on April 21st, 1911. Ren, do you want to talk about, isn't there something about like the hanging, some details about that?
Yeah. So what I've heard about the hanging, interestingly, the gallows at Walla Walla, they were made as twin gallows. So they're two together, and they were actually made in order to hang two brothers, I think, or relatives who had committed heinous crimes together. So the big plan at Walla Walla was to, build this fancy new gallows and then hang them at the same time. Again, there's no Hulu back in these days. So this was the grand entertainment of the time, and everybody came out to witness. But then when they hung them, they there was some technical difficulties at the gallows, and they ended up having to hang these guys like 10 minutes apart anyway because one of the gallows didn't work. That's the story I've heard. But once Romendorf is there anyway, we have the gallows, and Romendorf is being prepared, to hang. And some gallows trivia that I like to tell on my tours is that, there's all kinds of mathematics and things involved, but you have to have the right length of rope in order to hang the right weight of body, right? It has to be the right length or it won't actually do the job if it's too short or too long. I'll let you imagine that. And so while they're waiting for Romendorf to be hanged, he's going crazier and crazier, and he stops eating. And so he's rapidly losing weight. And the story that I've heard is that he's losing so much weight that they have to delay the hanging as they're trying to figure out the right length of the rope. But by the time they do it, he's just like barely in one piece.
Yeah. Trippy.
Right?
Yeah, and Washington, I think, no longer has death penalty if I'm remembering.
There's been a
correctly.
moratorium, yeah.
Yeah. But so there's an interesting history with the death penalty here and what types of death penalty were allowed. And yeah, hanging's a pretty brutal way to go. So he maintained his innocence to the end, and, papers and law enforcement were disappointed that he didn't confess or shed any light on a lot of mysteries that they were hoping could be cleared up if he spilled his beans at the end. And letters were sent from the prison chaplain to his daughter, letting her know that he departed from this life, that he was with him, and he did his best to cheer and comfort him in his hour of trouble, and that he left paper of instructions behind, which is not clear whether that was the weird coded letter.
Yeah.
But the weird coded letter was sent after the hanging, in a few days after, was sent to the Secret Service, hoping that they could decode it. And about a month later, they sent it back and were like, no, we're sorry. We regret very much. We cannot translate this because it's gobbledygook. But that didn't stop people for years from trying to translate it and coming to the same conclusion. Romendorf's daughters in 1919, so just a few years later, they both petitioned to change their names. The mother, Margaret, his wife, remarried pretty quickly to a man named Peter Olson, and she never had any more children, but they lived out their days in Maple Falls, and she's buried there. And the two daughters, Marjorie and
Bessie,
thank you, are buried at Bayview. They never had children. They both died within a few years of each other in the late 30s, early 40s, and they're both buried together in Bayview Cemetery. The weird outlier is the son / nephew / whatever he is.
Yeah, Ed.
Who just disappears from the records. And honestly, this whole family had to know what was going on with Romendorf / John / Logan the whole time. Like, there's so many instances of them basically like quickly moving one town to another. And I mean, there's just too many things. Like, whether they were, sort of coerced into being quiet and just going along with it, or whether they were like actively in on it all, it's hard to say. But it was definitely not Frank acting alone. Interesting stuff.
Yes, very interesting stuff. So, what do you guys think? Do you think that he really did kill the butcher? I kind of think that maybe he could have, if somebody really saw him in the butcher shop. Although, it's a little bit suspicious, like you said.
Well, do you want to go first, Ren, or do you want me to? I have opinions.
You have an opinion? Yeah, I'm interested to hear your opinion.
I have pretty solid opinions. I feel like it's not.
You always do.
It's not Dames. I do. Sorry. I don't feel like it's Dames's MO, or I mean Romendorf's MO to kill Dames.
Right.
Because he wasn't just a crazy psycho killer who brutally butchered people. I mean, his murders were horrible, but they were very calculated in how he offed people in order to get their land, their money. He had this whole plan. He did it in a way where he could conceal things and what had done. He assumed different identities. It was all like so calculated, whereas the crime against Dames just seemed like such a crime of passion, something that, was just so brutal and almost like careless in the way. It's kind of amazing that nobody was caught for it because it just seems so brutal. Like there should have been some
blood on someone's shirt or something like that. Do we know if anyone did stand to benefit at all from the butcher being killed? Like who inherited his shop afterwards or anything like that?
He had a sister who they found, and she hadn't heard from him in 20 years. And she was actually pretty stoked that he had an estate that she was going to inherit. But, it wasn't like she knew anything about it. It's actually a little bit up for question whether her mother, who was the aged blind mother she was taking care of, which is said to be Dames's mother as well. It could have been his stepmother. It's kind of unclear. But anyway, it was his sister, or at least half sister, that they tracked down and found. She was his only living relative, and she was taking care of a blind elderly woman and could use the money. So whatever Dames had went to her. It's probably a good thing. There didn't seem to be any reason to suspect her in the crime, as she was completely shocked and didn't know he was even still alive. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of mystery in between his time leaving home and why he was such a loner. He was in the Civil War. Did he make enemies there? I don't think Romendorf was the enemy. I mean, some people try to make that connection because they're both German and blah, blah, blah. But I can't find anything that puts them in a timeline together other than maybe right before the murder. And it just still, even if it was just like, oh, you ordered bad meat and you cursed me out and kicked me out of your butcher shop, like, I just don't feel like Romendorf would go there in that way.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think I totally agree with your perspective, Colby, because it does not match any of the other like MOs, which is that he kind of bludgeoned somebody and then, he kind of quietly killed them first and then disposed of them in really dark and twisted ways. But yeah, not bloody. But I mean, the guy was clearly unhinged. So,
right. But I mean, so was Weatherford.
Yeah. Right. And there was this thing, the dope fiends and the opium addicts. It's like, yeah.
I mean, and there, to me, there was a lot of evidence between Weatherford and those two other guys who all lived in shacks, and they were all suspects in that beginning. So I don't know. I lean towards them over anybody else, but also I think it could just be a random outlier. But I mean, I don't know. Like, why would Weatherford, crazy or not, have this story in his mind that he kept repeating? And to me, it seems like he either hung out, was part of it, heard it, something, which points to me to those like hobo shack situation.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, it's still a mystery, you guys.
That's my opinion. It's unsolved. It's an unsolved crime.
I just feel like we're ignoring the party with the most amount of resentment, which would be all of the animals that were butchered. Vengeful cow
yes,
spirits.
I think maybe it's the woman, the spirits. We need to talk to her,
I was
clearly.
gonna say, yeah, the cow spirits too, like just pour one out when you go to the red light bar for the cows.
So if you have any information on this 110-year-old cold case, please make sure to contact Colby and Ren, because I'm sure they'd love to finally have an answer to this decades-long mystery.
Yeah, if you're a spirit, you can reach out.
But I think with that, we're going to say good night to our beautiful friends, the Good Time Girls, and give them a big thank you for this fabulous two-parter.
You're so welcome.
Thank you.
That was so fun.
You're very welcome. Sleep tight. Oh, so we have a couple of bonus questions here we're going to tack on right here, and then we will get to our update.
Okay, this question is from the Maple Falls Murder Farm episode, and it's from an anonymous sender. And they ask, does anyone know where the murder farm is in Maple Falls?
So I'm going to say yes. That's Todd Warger, who is the author of the series of Murder in the Fourth Corner books, which you guys should all go and check out if this is your jam. Available at Village Books and all local booksellers. And I think he has a website online, and we link to it on our website. But in the first, I think it's, the first volume, pages 122 and 123 of Murder in the Fourth, he talks about he visited the farm, and I think he got shown around by neighbors, and there's not really much left there. Like, the original buildings are all gone and things like that, but he was able to trace it through property records. So there, I'm not going to shout out where it's at.
Right.
If you want to find out really bad,
yeah,
you could
buy a local author's incredible book. And if you're listening to this, you should be buying local authors' historical accounts that are available at Village Books from a small local vendor, and finding out more about history. Because there's these this kind of research is available to you, the listener, for sure.
Okay. This question is from Greg, and he asks, in your opinion, who is the most crazy local killer from any time period?
I just say whoever killed Dames, the butcher. I don't think there's anything crazier than that. But do you, Marissa?
I still think that Romendorf is the craziest killer. I still am not totally. I like that Colby and I have a robust debate about this. I'm not totally convinced that he did kill Dames. I'm not convinced that he did, but I'm not convinced that he didn't. It seems very up his alley to have killed Dames, and I think that there's some evidence that makes sense that he did. But I think Romendorf / Jans / Logan and all of his just killing people just to get their deeds and their land, and proposing marriage to women, and then shooting them in the back and burning their bodies. And it's just,
yeah, he was pretty nutty, and all that crazy stuff he did while he was in jail at the end, trying to make himself look crazy, but succeeded. Okay, so update time.
Yeah, tell us, Colby, because the story kind of just always gets deeper and deeper, and we're never able to tell all of it.
They're convoluted. There's so many weird details. So I have an Ancestry.com account that I often use for research purposes.
Okay, brag.
So I have a whole research tree. That's
Yes.
not my family tree, right? It's just my research tree. It's filled with people definitely not related to me, which really confuses a lot of people on Ancestry. Despite my labeling it as a research tree. Yeah. I'm not even going to go into how many messages I get.
They're desperate, and you do have the information, so...
I know, I'm just take the info and run with it. I'm not your relative. Anyway, it is a useful research tool, but yeah, mostly Ancestry is used by people doing their own genealogy. So that's the majority of people on there. And for those of you unfamiliar, the site gives you little hints for individuals in your tree based on either new records that have been added or connections from other people's trees that have been made with what the bots believe is your relative as well. Okay. So, it has its own little algorithms and things, right. And it finds these little hints.
If you add somebody to your thing, then they're like, ooh, there's a hint.
Yes. So somebody else who has the same connections in their their trees might get a hint based on your info or whatever. There's different reasons. But so, and they're just adding more documents all the time. As more and more info gets digitized or released, then more stuff comes online, which is always exciting. But I had made this like a research tree with Frank Romendorf family back like ages ago, right? And at that time, we lost track of the son / possible nephew, whatever he was, who went by Edward, Edwin, Eddie, and alias George B. Hilton. Yeah, so we know that Frank's wife she remarried, continued to live out her days in Maple Falls, married to a man there. The daughters changed their surnames legally to Lewis, and they continued also to live in Maple Falls, but never married or had children. They're buried together in Bayview Cemetery. And we didn't know what happened to the son. And then recently I logged back on there and I saw some hints, and it turned out Edwin Lewis, as he spent the rest of his life being called. So he took the
name, yeah.
Lewis as his siblings.
Okay.
And he went by Edwin F. Lewis for the rest of his life. He had gone off and he served in World War I. He became a railroad engineer, and he married a little Mormon gal out in Wyoming / Utah area.
Yep.
And they had some children. He had a boy and a girl. The girl was born in 1920 but died young at age 10 of spinal meningitis.
Oh, wow.
Not great. But the son grew up and had a family of his own. So it was clearly
They continued
their
on.
descendants had been doing their family tree research and made this connection to Frank Romendorf, which I'm like, can you imagine? You're just like, let's do our genealogy. Oh, great-grandpa was a weird-ass serial murderer.
Scary dude.
So I am so sorry,
Yeah.
descendants. This is all public information. I'm not going to name current names or anything, but like, yeah. Sorry if you're out there. That's rough. But this brought me back, like, so there's descendants of good old Frank Romendorf, and they all changed their names, obviously, so they're all not using that surname Romendorf. Or Friedrich Johns as his birth name is supposedly Jans or Johns. But Romendorf, this name has always just bothered me. I am struck by just the weirdness of picking that as a name. There are literally 0 other people with this surname anywhere that I can find.
No way.
Almost anywhere in the world. There is a place name. It's in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's called Romensdorf, also called Romendorf. It was like a little tiny village that was settled by Germans.
Oh, interesting.
And so I'm like, maybe he had some family connection to that place since it was settled by Germans. Unknown. But where he pulled this name out of his ass and decided, and okay, dude, if you're going to be like committing crimes and running from the law.
Yeah.
I mean,
Smith.
I know. I'm like, don't pick a name that no one else has. What are you doing?
The most, like
just unique name in the
unique
entire
rolls
country.
off the tongue, like name. Oh my goodness.
So this leads me to just like I don't think this guy was the like brilliant mastermind type of criminal.
Smart,
no, I don't know.
Just
I mean,
lucky.
he was smart enough to forge documents and assume people's identities and get away with quite a number of murders. But I did dive back into his like Nebraska history, which is where his wife was from and her entire family. And he was stealing cattle down there. And it's real weird because they do just up and leave from there. They go to Indiana where they're listed under their middle names, but still Romendorf. But he's like going by Edward and she's going by Annie, which is their middle name.
She's in on it at this point.
100%.
100%.
I think the entire family at least knew whether they were like willing participants or more just sort of like coerced.
We're going along. And it seems like it got more and more intense.
Yes. I think Frank, because in Nebraska, he had all kinds of legal troubles, whether he was murdering people down there yet or not. He clearly was having financial troubles, legal troubles. He did a stint in the pen for that cattle thieving. And
as we've talked about.
And I feel like once he's done it once he's managed to kill someone and assume their identity and get their money, he probably realized that was a pretty good grift.
Yeah.
And
and
he just,
whether he wanted to or not, it just like that was
his
desperate
thing.
times.
Yeah.
And like Bonnie and Clyde, right?
I know. And I feel like it's a little bit Like, it reminds me of also, like, it's like the Bloody Benders, you know, that story of that creepy ass family in like Kansas or somewhere that like murdered people at their inn. It was like contemporaneous in the 1870s with like Little House on the Prairie and shit.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, you have to look up the Bloody Benders.
I will.
They're a great story. But yeah, they were a creepy sounding family that ran like a little roadside inn where they just offed people. They knocked them out and threw them in the basement, and they put them out and like fed them to the hogs. There's so many bodies on this farm, but they were robbing them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they disappeared.
Survived.
They never were found.
No way.
But they found all the murdered bodies everywhere.
All right, everyone.
So I'm like,
Homework.
maybe the Romandorfs are secretly the Benders.
Right? Or they took a hint.
Right?
They like were on the end.
But it is interesting, like a family that definitely seems to at least be covering for him.
Oh yeah. They
Like,
have cover.
yeah. So that I was really struck again. Like, why this guy? Here's one thing though. With the connection to dames, like I didn't find that there was a very strong one. I still don't. But one thing I did find interesting is that I looked up exactly when he got his land in Maple Falls, and that was June and July of 1905. So that is like a month after Dame's murder.
Oh, that's a new, yeah.
So I was like, I have a mention of him in a Seattle hotel in November of 1903. So clearly he's been to the area. Maybe
Right.
he's scouting for land. So he was around,
Whoa.
but he didn't buy that property until right after Dames was murdered. So I was like, is there some connection?
Did he get some money?
Was Dames connected in some way to like, getting that
Dames,
property?
yeah.
Or because that was his MO, like getting property and
Yeah.
money from killing people. But I think if you wanted to pin the murder on Romandorf, that would be the angle to look at.
Yeah, I think so. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I hadn't really made that connection before, but I was like, I really need to look at this timeline and see like
Yeah.
when exactly were they, overlapping. But there's really no other any connections or things putting them together other than people being like, they were German. I saw them arguing. But
Yeah,
they're
and
both
the-
such mysteries.
The saw them arguing thing, as we addressed in the last one, like that people were saying he threw Donnelly or whatever out of the thing.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like it changes.
And
so-
that was never brought up initially. It was only
Right.
after.
Romandorf came up after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just think there's still so many unknowns about both Romandorf and Dames. Like, there's whole swaths of their history that have been very difficult to trace because they were both kind of weird
Secretive
dudes
and-
that moved around a lot. And, like, Dames didn't really have family connections. He was
Right.
constantly moving. Nobody really knew him very well. Like, he didn't have close people. And they're both weird.
Very German.
As were the Benders.
Oh,
we
the
think.
Benders were too?
Yes.
I swear. Oh my gosh. All right, you guys.
I'm starting a whole new rumor
Keep on
about this
listening.
case.
Yeah, now we're going to have all these like Reddit detectives on the case. Those details are pretty wild. Maybe they
I
were
always
good.
wondered if someone was like paying, like the enemy, whoever his enemy was,
Yeah.
like paid these bumbling guys to like off the guy they didn't like or something.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot more that could have happened.
Oh, for sure.
But like the passion of the crime is weird, but like maybe they're just idiots and they
I
get
feel
like,
maybe they were just idiots.
like-
and they were just trying to carry out the damn thing.
yeah, and they just kind of overdid it.
Yeah, Romandorf would have never done that.
No.
Yeah, again, sorry to the Lewis family and their ties to this evil person. I mean, the son even though, we don't even know if he was actually the son or not.
It seems like he probably was.
Okay.
He was real shifty. Like, he was definitely actively helping
Yeah.
Romandorf. At least.
He knew.
Yeah.
He knew something, but then
Yeah.
he got off.
I mean, so was Margaret, the wife of Romandorf. She was, like, in Colville trying to, like, make sure the property didn't... She was... It's unclear whether Romandorf was like, you gotta go and like do this and telling her what to do, but I mean, she was doing it. She was trying to like make sure they kept their property and cover the tracks, and she told all kinds of different stories to the police. And
then who in Maple Falls is like, that's who I want for a wife? Like,
right? And Sarah and I drove past the property because Sarah's got some relatives that live up in Silver Lake area, and it's right on Silver Lake Road. None of the buildings are there.
Right.
But it was wild to kind of just drive past there.
Yeah,
And
kind of how far out it is.
Uncle Don is like in his 90s and has lived out there his whole life. He remembered the Lewis girls, the sisters. They just like hung out together and would like walk into town together. And
I mean, bless their hearts, but the goddamn son or brother of the Lewis girls goes on to procreate. I really hope Lewis family, just keep an eye out. Just saying. Oh Lord, pretty wild. It's such a great story, and it just continues.
I know.
And there will probably never be an end to the weirdness that comes about from it. So I guess with that said, everybody remember that Colby does his family research.
Yeah.
So if you're curious,
if you're not afraid of what you might find in your tree, give me a shout.
If you want to roll the fucking dice, Colby's here for you. Oh man, it's just the gift that keeps on giving, the whole Romendorf story.
It really is.
Yeah, it's fun to be able to like elaborate just a little in these podcasts.
I know. Well, and it's just amazing, like with newspapers, it more and more digitized all the time. Yeah. And it's just a freaking treasure trove of stuff, you know.
Right.
Like,
whether we can believe it or not, it's just...
Oh, God.
What a good episode. Okay. Thank you, Colby. God.
Okay, so I guess let's wrap it up. We'd like to thank you all for listening to Belling History with the Good Time Girls. And we will have one more re-release episode coming up. Ooh. And then some new episodes just around the corner. Thanks for hanging in there with us.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man hates without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Thanks again for listening. Do subscribe and review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms. Like us on social media. Check out our tours, events, read our show notes and our blog, all at bellinghistory.com.
Oh, Lou loves you red, Lou loves you blue. Most of the time, Lou just loves you blue. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat, I lost my brim. I look like a crow's nest swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
And as usual, we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers and Devin Champlin on Bandcamp, and you can find Devin Champlin down at the old Champlin Guitars in Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Be sure to tune in next time for our last Bad Town episode and more with Belling History with the Good Time Girls.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.